Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in the Psychology of Creativity. Now, if you recall, within the last class, we explored some of the creative process, and part of that process was what is known as the incubation stage. Now, I'd like to just dive into that a little more deeply today and to explore a little bit of the cognitive mechanisms of creativity. So let's begin with what is known as the conscious work theory. Now, along these lines, we have what is known as the conscious work theory, and what conscious work theory says is that you don't really stop working on the problem when you enter the incubation stage. That you are, in essence, thinking about the problem in very small spurts as your brain has time throughout the course of the day. So what conscious work theory suggests is that you are indeed still consciously working upon the problem, but you are simply doing it not in a focused way, but in a bit of a scattered, broken up way, where you are, in essence, daydreaming about it from time to time as your brain is allowed and as your attention allows throughout the course of your day-to-day activities. But perhaps in such small spurts that you are not really registering that you are actually thinking of the problem in any significant way. So that's the conscious work theory of the creative process. Then there is something known as the recovery from fatigue theory. And the recovery from fatigue theory suggests that when you work on a problem so intensely and so deeply that your brain simply gets tired. And so the incubation period is a beneficial stage that you can go through to rejuvenate your mind, to allow your mind to adjust and rest from the problem, so that it can come back and you can see it from a new and refreshed perspective, a new light, and in a more agile kind of way. And its thinking, in essence, is that it's like recharging your cognitive battery so that you can again re-engage with the problem that you're dealing with. Then there is something known as the unconscious work theory. And this unconscious work theory suggests that you are indeed continuing to work on the problem, but at a deeper level than you are consciously aware of. It is more akin to simply not reflecting upon the problem, but having part of your mind so focused upon the problem that you are not consciously aware that you are working on it. And so it is essentially the idea that parts of your mind are working upon the problem, but the executive, reflective parts of your mind are simply not aware of that work, that work is still going on, which is perfectly feasible because much of what we do in life and in existence is not available to our conscious awareness unless we put some great effort into reflecting upon it. Then there is another theory of the creative mechanisms of cognitive mechanisms of creativity, known as the remote association theory. And the remote association theory suggests that what is happening is that you have an automatic process within your brain that takes the information of the problem and is actively comparing the parameters of that problem to known associations that you have within your brain for different problems. Types of heuristics, for example, and problem-solving skills that you've already have available to you, and your mind is applying these rough and ready rules for problem solving to the problem that you are dealing with to see which one works best. Now, according to this remote association theory, when your mind finds an association that seems to be a reasonably good fit, then it reveals itself to your conscious awareness so that you can further evaluate that association. But it only does that when there seems to be a reasonable association. And so it does not bother you with all of the other extraneous, seemingly useless associations that it is trying in that as it works in the realm of the subconscious, the unconscious. And so that is the remote association theory. Then there is another cognitive theory known as the opportunistic assimilation theory. And the opportunistic assimilation theory suggests that you set aside the problem, but it is somewhat primed within your unconscious awareness so that when something in your environment primes an association that seems to be a reasonably good fit, that the mind, the unconscious parts of the mind, makes you aware of the possible association that takes place. So, it isn't necessarily that you are working upon the problem constantly, but your mind is primed in such a way that it is looking for associations as you experience them in the world. And if it finds one that seems to be a good fit for understanding or solving the creative problem that is before you, then it reveals that to you. So that would be the opportunistic assimilation theory. Now, so those are some of the cognitive models of creativity. Okay, so those are some of the theories about why the incubation portion of the cognitive process is so very important. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about the ideas of convergent and divergent thinking and different ways that theorists have kind of suggested how this can play into creative thinking and the life and work of creative thinkers. So in essence, convergent thinking is focusing on finding one well-defined solution to a problem. Divergent thinking is the opposite of convergent thinking and involves more creativity. And in essence, it is looking for many different possibilities that come from this problem instead of one well-defined solution. And so we'll explore the differences and the importance of each within the creative process. First off, though, we should acknowledge that a psychologist by the name of J.P. Guilford coined the terms convergent and divergent thinking back in the 1950s, 1956. And convergent thinking focuses on reaching one well-defined solution to a problem. And this type of thinking is best for tasks that involve logic as opposed to creativity, such as, for example, answering multiple choice tests or solving a problem where you know that there are no other possible solutions. Divergent thinking is the opposite of convergent thinking in essence and involves more creativity. Now, with this type of thinking, you can generate ideas and develop multiple solutions to the problem. Now, while divergent thinking often involves brainstorming for many possible answers to the question, the goal is the same as convergent thinking, to essentially arrive at the best solution, to come up with some kind of practical answer to the problem. Now, in practice, here's what these different types of thinking might look like. So, for example, convergent thinking would be, if the copy machine breaks at work, a convergent thinker would call a technician right away in order to have that machine fixed. a divergent thinking person, however, if the copy machine breaks at work, a divergent thinker would try to determine the cause of the copy machine's malfunction and assess the various ways to fix the problem. One option might be to call the technician, while others might be to look up some YouTube video on how to fix the problem, or look at a diagnostic diagram on the user manual, or come up with their own homemade solution. These would be examples of a divergent thinker, someone that is engaged in the process and wants to find a solution. And so you can see there that there are some obviously very practical ways of using both convergent and divergent thinking. And just recognizing that divergent thinking is oftentimes very valuable within the creative problem-solving process. Now, ideally, what researchers suggest is that you find a good mix of convergent and divergent thinking to solve problems within the creative project that one is dealing with. So, for example, you might start off by using divergent thinking. So the first stage of creative problem solving might be it's in discovering what the problem is. That's the first stage. You'll need to use some divergent thinking to recognize the problem, to see the problem, to discover the cause of the problem, and to consider all the possibilities around the problem. That would be what a divergent thinking person would do. Then you might look at convergent thinking as a second step within that process, where you would use convergent thinking to narrow down the potential causes of the problem, while also recognizing that there are some limitations. So like you might have budget limitations, you might have time limitations to your project. And so these would all be factors that a convergent thinker would use to trim down the kinds of approaches that would be used in order to solve a problem. And then you might come back to the deductive phase, the third stage in this process, where you would again use divergent thinking, where you switch back to the divergent thinking to find a solution to the problem within the parameters that were set by the convergent thinking process. So you might have these limitations. So you might determine that there are certain ways of expressing the creative task within a certain budget, and so you'll work within that budget but be as creative as you can within that budget in order to complete the task. And then finally, in the last stage of, say, for example, problem solving for a project, you might come back to convergent thinking again, where you are again thinking about coming to a resolution point, that single resolution point where you can eliminate the problem. And you might want to kind of express that in one singular way. And that just gives you an example of a good balance between convergent thinking, where you're looking at one practical solution that you will choose to take, and divergent thinking, which is looking at the various possibilities and seeing what are the different creative ways that one can go about doing something. And it can be, just a wonderful balance when you have these two types of thinking working together. So that would be the idea of convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Recognizing, of course, that divergent thinking is an essential part of the creative process, while also acknowledging that in order to really get things done and to really tie things up in a practical way, you do need some level of convergent thinking within that. Then there is also another model of creative cognitive processes known as lateral versus vertical thinking. And lateral versus vertical thinking has as one of its primary proponents a researcher by the name of Edward de Bono. And so in this case, lateral thinking is somewhat illogical and creative. It's emotional based. It's chaotic based. It's kind of random. It's the type of thinking that is not logical at all, or not on the face of it logical. Vertical thinking, though, is sequential. It is simply seeking order out of chaos. Within this lateral kind of thinking, there might be new concepts. Now, this is supposed to, when we think in terms of vertical thinking, we're thinking vertical thinking is something that is very logical, very sequential, where you begin with a starting point, and from that start point, you take logical, sequential steps toward a conclusion. And this is good and beneficial in many ways, so long as your first steps are in the right direction. However, sometimes that is not the case. So these sequential steps do not lead to a good outcome, and so another approach may be required. And this is where the lateral thinking of creativity can, in a way, be a benefit. Now, David Perkins has a very good example of lateral versus vertical thinking in something that he calls the Klondike spaces. Now, in this example, we can just picture an old-time prospector searching for gold. A vertical thinker will dig a hole. And if he doesn't find gold, he digs the same hole deeper and deeper. Now, by contrast, and I think we could see where this is going, a lateral thinker will say, well, there's no gold here, and will move laterally to a new location, seemingly at random, and try again by digging a new hole. And eventually, the lateral thinker finds the gold, whereas the vertical thinker just ends up with a really deep hole that is unproductive. Now, what I hope you recognize here is that most researchers see that creative thinking does differ from normal logical thinking in some ways. But both are necessary for real, concrete creative achievement. You can't just have divergent thinking. You can't just have lateral thinking and only that, or things are just not going to get done. You need a balance of both. Now, there's another type of thinking that is known as Janusian thinking. And this was something that was first described by Alan Rothenberger at Harvard Medical School. And this is essentially the idea to conceive of two antithetical or seemingly opposing points of view simultaneously. Hence the term Janusian, which is taken from the Janus head. So Janus was the Roman mythic god with two faces. We can also think of this as paradoxical thinking. Now, what's paradoxical thinking? Paradoxical thinking is a process in which you identify and define contrasting characteristics. So, for example, you're trying to get people to work together. You might find contrasting personal characteristics in order to bring about their positive aspects. So, by following the paradoxes of an extrovert and introvert and finding the balance between them, or finding the special strengths of each, you find that they work together in a great way in order to complete a task. So the paradox here involves contradictory, mutually exclusive elements that are present and operate equally at the same time. Hence, what Rothenberg spoke of as Januszian thinking. There's two different faces on this problem, and you can use both of them. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can apply this kind of Januszian paradoxical thinking. So, for example, we all come across personal paradoxes where we can be used to kind of explain successes for, an elite athlete or an executive business leader or a company CEO or a political leader or educational administrator or whatever. So, for example, sprinters actually run faster if they can remain relaxed while sprinting. Sprinters need to develop an ability to simultaneously engage the exact opposite quality of what their sport seems to demand: calmness and relaxation. So the sprinter cannot have a balance between the two states of relaxation of relaxation and muscle engagement, but they must work as hard as they can at the same time to maintain relaxation in their muscles and in their mind. So it's finding that fine-tuned paradoxical Januszian kind of thinking that sometimes is really essential. And finally, there's the idea of analogical thinking. Now, an analogy really is a comparison between two objects or systems of objects that highlight respects in which they are thought to be similar. So analogical reasoning or thinking is any type of thinking that relies upon an analogy. And an analogical argument, for example, is an explicit representation of a form of analogical reasoning that cites accepted similarities between two systems to support the conclusion that some further similarity exists. In general, but not always, such arguments belong to the category of ampliative reasoning, since their conclusions do not follow with certainty, but are only supported by varying degrees of strength. Now, here's a good example, I think, of creative analogical thinking. In places in Europe, there are grasses that locals will call cleavers. And these cleavers, these wild grasses, are naturally occurring local plants that grow in the wild. And these cleavers, or sometimes people call them sticklebacks, because they have little hooks all over them that make them stick to your clothes. And you go walking in a field and you see that you have all sorts of grasses stuck to the bottoms of your socks and the lower parts of your pants. And you just pull off a bunch and you throw them away, or you throw them at each other and you have a little bit of fun with it. Now, there are many plants that grow like this and that have evolved these kind of skills. There's plants, there's all sorts of things. But one person with analogical thinking took this idea. In 1941, George de Mestral was walking in the mountains with his dog. And he noticed some of these seed pods, these plants, getting caught in his dog's fur. And it got him thinking about an idea. So George de Mestral was a Swiss individual, born in 1907, and his father was a civil engineer, and he himself was very interested in engineering and actually did training in engineering. So he had the technical skills, but while he was enjoying hunting and while he was trying to clean some of these plants off of his dog, he noticed that they had these microscopic hooks. And this got him thinking analogically about what could be done with these hooks in industry and in commerce. And so he took this idea, this analogical way of thinking, and fastened some synthetic fasteners. And then, because these little hooks on these plants seem to always get caught in fabric, he thought, well, we can connect this with the fabric industry with these little tiny microscopic hooks. And then he thought, whoa, what can we call this? Well, the fabric we're using is kind of like a velvet. It's for the French word velours, and there's some hooks on it, and so that's kind of like a crochet hook. And so maybe we'll call this little invention of mine Velcro. And so we have this great product that we know of today as Velcro, being the result of analogical thinking of a engineer that was so very interested in finding a solution to a problem. Analogical thinking is a kind of, in many ways, a kind of lateral thinking, a creative way of thinking, a divergent way of thinking that sees possibilities where others do not, and takes those creative leaps to discover that there might be other applications than simply a grass in nature or a seed pod in nature. That maybe, just maybe, we can use them in our own ways. So that is analogical thinking. Then there is also another type of cognitive processes that we might see in creative thinking is what is known as metaphorical thinking. Now, metaphors sometimes get mistaken with similes, but the two are not the same. A simile makes a comparison to, but uses the word like, as in time is like money. The idea is like half-baked food. Similes often sound less powerful than metaphors, even if the idea is the same thing. The simple metaphor format is A is B, as in time is money. But metaphors can also be indirect or implicit. That's a half-baked idea. This metaphor compares ideas to part-cooked food without the mention of the food. So what is metaphorical ideas? It is by associating an unfamiliar idea with one that is commonplace. And in so doing, you can spark a better understanding of a complex idea. So again, you can see a little bit of associations in there. You can see a little bit of divergent thinking, of lateral thinking within metaphorical thinking. Metaphors, though, are great in that they capture the essence of what is going on within a problem. And so metaphorical thinking can be of great value for the creative process as well. So those are some examples of various cognitive processes that we can see within the creative process. We can see metaphorical thinking. We can see analogical thinking. We can see paradoxical or Janusian approaches to thinking. We can recognize that there's a difference between convergent and divergent thinking, recognizing that both are valuable, that we need divergent thinking in order to find the possibilities, and convergent thinking in order to make things practical. And then we have those different ways of understanding why incubation is so useful. There's the cognitive work theory, the recovery from fatigue theory, the unconscious work theory, the remote association theory, and the opportunistic assimilation theory. All wonderful ways to help us understand the creative process and the psychology of creativity. I hope you enjoyed this week. You take care. Bye-bye.